Ready?
I am ready when you are.
All right. All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our virtual forum with Mapping the Field of Adult and Continuing Education. Today we are talking about adult education for employment in a global economy. My name is Leslie Cordy. I'm a director at large for AAACE, and I will be helping facilitate this along with Terry at AAACE. My biggest concern right now is that you are able to log in and make sure that you can see the presentation that Dr. Scully-Russ has made available to us, along with the chat. Make sure that you have joined by computer audio. It's not necessary for us to see you, but we like to see your smiling faces and to sort of get a read on how we're doing during this presentation. If you have any questions, you may email or chat with me or Terry, and we can help you with any of those technologies. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Alan Knox to make the introduction for Dr. Scully-Russ. Alan?
I am delighted to welcome you all to the 6th bi-monthly virtual forum with Ellen as the focus, discussing her Article 62. The AAACE website has information about other compendium-related activities and publications for educators of adults in AAACE and partner associations. So I'm looking forward as well to the discussion with Ellen and all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to share some of my work with you here today. I'm really anxious to have a conversation with you all about some of your ideas and experiences related to this topic. So although I have prepared a formal PowerPoint presentation, I invite questions or comments along the way. And then also at the end, we can also spend a little time talking more in-depthly. So just a way of background, I'm Ellen Scully-Russ. I'm an associate professor of human and organizational learning at the George Washington University. I have a degree in adult education from Columbia Teachers College. Prior to working on my degree, I spent many years working with the U.S. labor movement on education and training issues, negotiating and setting up job training and retraining programs for workers in a variety of industries. So I come at this perspective as an educator, but I also come at it as a kind of a workplace labor market activist who, had spent a considerable amount of time in the workplace, really, and in industry, trying to understand and address some of the broader dynamics that make it possible for some adults to access and continuous learning resources, whereas, make it impossible for others. And so my central argument here, as well as in many other parts of my work, is that adult educators are extremely talented and insightful and skilled at addressing the education and training needs, as well as the personal development needs of adults. And that is extremely important and essential to our practice, but it's not sufficient today because of these broader dynamics and the importance of work in people's lives, that we really do need to develop strong insights into labor markets and real skills at advocating and as being activist in the broader policy arena. And I include organizations, workplaces in that institutional environment as well. So I'm going to share a little bit of my work in this area with you all here today, but I really would like to engage in a conversation about kind of your experiences and insights into into some of the same dynamics that kind of capture my attention and interest. So just want to spend a little bit of time, talking about sort of the cultural material that's out there for us to make sense of the changing sort of opportunity structures in society and the importance of education and training in that dialogue or in that narrative. So we've all, and a lot of what I'm going to show you here or share with you is just sort of on the web. If you just Google images for lifelong learning or skills, I mean, you're going to see a lot of the same things, but really the message behind it is that, obviously education is important, but that, it's got to be sort of more of a global perspective, and the whole notion of sort of global competitiveness that's driving the need for advanced and continuous learning credentials, etc. But at the same time, we've got this I wouldn't necessarily call it a competing discourse, but this parallel discourse that say, well, okay, that education is important, but what's really gonna, make the difference for folks is their development of these employability skills, which, as you can see from this map, are extremely far-reaching, and I would suggest also ever-growing. This map is probably more dense than than others, but I think you can see that it really takes someone who is always on the ball and really attending to almost every stimulus in their life to be considered employable if you really were to take this map to heart. And these messages, are kind of what adults hear, especially adults who are feeling insecure in their work roles, and yet, many adults don't really have the resources, or maybe if they do, they don't really know how to apply them in ways that are really going to matter for them in terms of their own development and skills formation. So we've got sort of, this competing sort of conversation out there where, education is important, and yet skills are really where the action is. And sometimes these two sort of images and developmental tracks don't necessarily come together in real ways. And at the same time, we've got these images as well that, we can just sort of open up people's heads and dump this stuff in there and upload it, if you would, so that really makes learning not look very difficult. It's kind of like, yeah, if you get exposed to ideas or different skills, then you've learned it and you ought to be able to apply it. And this also sends the message that kind of what we do and how we do it really isn't as challenging from an educational perspective as we know it to be. So another kind of image is that it's time is up. We've got to skill up, and we've got to do it sort of from this sort of multitasking perspective. And then of course we have to learn fast. We have to learn rapidly because it's always time to skill up, and it's never really enough. Then of course the looming threat is that if we don't, then there's something out there that can replace kind of human effort, and that only very few people will be left in the work systems, and a lot of other people will be kind of left out and left behind. There's lots of interesting research out there really trying to get a handle on, kind of what is the new division of labor between machines and people, and what are the kind of roles going to look like in the future. And the predictions are that machines will increase their contribution up to 57% of the division of labor by taking on new roles that were typically seen as ones that humans would be more apt to do, such as reasoning, decision-making, all kinds of administrative functions, and working obviously with information. So I think that there's something here that we ought to be paying very close attention to. But, as with other eras of technological change, I don't think it's helpful to think it's sort of inevitable, that the trajectory can't be somehow influenced. And I think that that's kind of the message I want to take away here today, is that we can do an awful lot on the policy and programmatic level to try to keep people's skills current. But if we're not also intervening into the dynamics that really foster these major shifts in technology, how it's used, what its role is in the work function as compared to what human effort would look like, then we lose whatever leverage we might have to really promote a skills agenda. So it's not enough to promote the skills. We also have to get inside the workplaces and inside the other sort of areas of the political economy to make some inroads into what the future of work really looks like, and what it can potentially be. And so there's lots of addition to sort of these narratives and discourses out there, there's lots of contradictory facts that I think, call for a fair amount of new research into what's really going on in the global labor market and in obviously local ones as well. So for example, we do have evidence, empirical evidence to say, yes, there's increased demand for workers with higher skill levels. But we also have evidence that shows that the fastest growing jobs, particularly here in the US, are at the lower end of the skills continuum. So it's paradoxical, if not very contradictory. Short-term shortage of high-skilled workers, yet at the same time, we're seeing new reports coming out that say you sort of track the trends in employer requirements for skills, and that as the unemployment rate goes up or down, those requirements follow sort of like. So when the unemployment rate goes up, the skills requirement goes up. When it goes down, the skills requirement goes down. And we're able to see that right now because the unemployment rate is declining, as are a lot of the educational requirements that employers are. And we can also see it now because we have sort of big data to look across like monster.com and really aggregate and analyze what are the requirements and kind of where they've moved and how they've moved over the years. We also know that there is an educational wage premium that people with higher education typically do, can expect a higher wage. However, we also see similar or contradictory trend that tells us when more educated workers enter into a particular occupational labor market, this wage premium diminishes. So there's a sort of if there are, again, it goes back to, are skills or are workers in short supply or not? And if so, then this wage premium just doesn't hold up as it might otherwise. So looking at these labor market data, and there's obviously much more that we could look at here, kind of doesn't tell the full story. So the full story of kind of opportunity and sort of access to lifelong learning in society today. So if we took a look at, for example, social mobility, which is really the likelihood that a child would advance beyond his or her social or economic origins. So stats around Brookings came out with this study a while ago, and the stats around the mobility of children born to parents at the bottom quintile of the economic strata. So you can see here, the numbers are kind of bleak, right? 1 in 3 get stuck, 1 in 10 make it to the top. White Americans face roughly the same chances of being stuck at 23% as they do with making it to the top. So if you're white, you've got a better chance at mobility than if you're, say, from an African-American descent or an African-American child. Single parent children also have a more difficult time. And if you don't complete high school, obviously, it's also very difficult to experience any social mobility. And 1 in 3 who are college educated face better odds, 14% of them remain stuck and 20 make it to the top. So, these are, again, sort of ways of sort of slicing and dicing the data to think about kind of, what are the factors that seem to matter, and where might we begin to focus our attention. So let's look, for example, at jobs, right? So, we talk about the new normal, the gig economy, you know, the what we're euphemistically now calling the encore career. I mean, people are working longer. We're working more jobs. You know, there's some folks who actually don't have jobs, but they have plenty of work. And yet, you know, our social institutions and labor market institutions really don't support workers who are either choosing to or have no choice but to work in these kinds of labor market environments and situations. So sort of let's take a little look at some of the data around labor market conditions and outcomes over the last couple of maybe decades. So we've got a surge in extremely high incomes at the top, you know, deciles. We have static wages and decline in real income, especially for lower waged workers. At the same time, we have enormous increases in productivity, the growth of contingent work relationships and arrangements, and the devolution of the employment contract. And then, of course, with a lot of the unemployment and lack of stability in wages, as well as, you know, tinkering around and changing our tax system, we've got a, you know, decrease in the tax base and erosion of the safety net, which all of this continuously, you know, structurally disadvantages some people over others. So income wealth inequities in the U.S. is the highest point since 1928. We know what that was. Top 10% take home 50% of the income, 1% take home 22% of the income, and the average household income in that decade there dropped by 36%. All while the average a number of hours that most adults work have steadily increased, making access to education and training from a resource of both time and money perspective even more challenging. At the same time, the nature of work is changing and shifting, and there's a lot of new research around these trends. We've got sort of, you know, work has become more transitional. New employment patterns, you know, predicated on frequent shifts and transitions are much more prevalent. Risk intensive. There's a lot out there about how the responsibility for, you know, what labor market attachment is shifted to individuals and families, making, you know, investments in education and training more risky for people. And learning and knowledge intensive work and workplaces are central sites of adult learning today. And if you're in a workplace that supports that, then obviously you're a little bit more disadvantaged than if you're in a workplace where there are no resources available to you to support your ongoing learning. So, you know, what we see is, you know, this sort of new precarious work situation emerging where, you know, you're lacking in predictability or security, lower variable wages, limited and no access to social benefits, lots of contingent and isolated work situations where you don't really develop the social capital that you need to remain sort of attached in the labor market. And work becomes a central site of adult learning, yet precarious workers are cut off and therefore further widening the education gap. And so, you know, the question here is, you know, under these conditions, it's great to say, well, let's just increase access to education and training through public resources. But the question really becomes is how do we make those skills pay for those that choose to invest their time and some folks their money in that additional training? How do we leverage that kind of investment to really ensure that, you know, this changing nature of work is such that is developmental and as beneficial to people and adult learners and workers, and not continuously or getting to the point where it's actually oppressive. So another source of information that we can look to really try to get a better sense of what's going on are the PAAC findings. For those of you who are knowledgeable of the PAAC, I apologize, but I want to just very quickly mention that OECD commissioned a study, an international comparison of adult skills and competencies was literacy, so it was reading, numeracy, and problem solving in a technologically rich environment. And it's all competency based. So you would actually sit at a computer or work with a test administrator to actually, go through a series of exercises that would measure people's competencies along those three skill areas. And then they also have a pretty extensive background questionnaire that allow for researchers to really take a look at labor market trends. So kind of who gets access to education and training, what your degrees are, what your wages are, what your labor market attachment has been, what is the nature of your work, what are some of the things that you do at work on an everyday basis, how do you use your skills at work. It's pretty robust. And I think it allows for some interesting research that we haven't had data to really do on a large scale in the past. The challenge is really getting the database to be a little bit more robust than it is, but the basic infrastructure is there to, I think, to start asking some higher level questions around the sort of labor market outcomes of skills and education in ways that we've not been able to do before. So let's take a look at what we can know. I took a look at some of the early studies that were commissioned by AAR, which is the American Institutes of Research, and they're the contractor that is administering this survey and assessment here in the United States. So I took a look at about, I would say over a couple of year period, maybe 15 of their studies related to the labor market and labor market outcomes. And just some high level findings here. Labor market returns for education and training, according to these studies, this whole idea of the education wage premium was confirmed, but it was also a little bit more nuanced in that different outcomes were identified for people with the same level of education. So there was a lot of skill variation amongst folks who actually had the same degree. So for example, people from first generation college students, for example, had lower scores, as did people coming out of different schools. So different schools or different regions were producing different skills and labor market outcomes for the same degree. So it really showed that, yes, there is a wage premium, but there's a lot of things that matter as to whether or not that premium returns to you individually, I guess is really what this data tells us. Not all education is recognized and valued in the same way. So for example, people with foreign earned credentials were obviously not making as much money or accessing the higher end jobs as folks with US credentials, yet they were the same credential. We also could see gender differences in labor market outcomes for the same degree, as well as, for example, we could see differences for women with STEM-related credentials, pretty much associated with the types of jobs that women might get, like, say, for example, nursing, which isn't even classified as a STEM occupation, but of course it is. So there's lots of gender issues that also structural differences that could be identified with this data. So another finding had to do with this whole link between education, skill, and inequality. So skills as measured by PAAC did not contribute to so these are the studies that looked not just at the US, but compared many studies or many countries in the database. So skills as measured by, what they found was skills as measured by PAAC did not necessarily contribute to economic inequality within and across nations, which I think is a very interesting finding, because what it tells us is that, skills is not as important for whether or not people can achieve any sense of economic, or society can achieve economic equity, that other factors mattered more they had more explanatory potential for the inequalities that we're seeing within and across nations than skill did. And some of these included education and skill, yes, union density, access to training, and this was, sort of through your employer or through government programs that you were actually accessing, alternative earnings such as bonuses, for example, and labor market regulations. And so those countries that had a constellation of these kinds of supports for workers, we could see that skills mattered less for labor market outcomes than they might in areas that didn't have these constellations of institutional supports.
Ellen, I have a question.
Sure.
Going back 3 or 4 slides to where you're talking about, education brings increased pay, the increased premium. But the, converse is, when you get the increased education, it results in lowered premiums. I guess another way to look at that would be increased pay for the earner is increased cost for the employer. Which brings up the question, is education worth the cost to hire somebody with the education? And I think that kind of is fitting into what you're beginning to talk here, but I don't know if that's being answered in this research. Is anybody looking at, is the education actually worth the cost?
Mm-hmm.
Is it bringing something to the table that's bringing worth that warrants that increased premium?
That's a very good question, and I don't think I've seen any research particularly focused on that question from the employer's perspective, right? I think we see some research related to, or at least some, a new narrative beginning to emerge is related to education, and that is the investment, is the individual's investment in education really worth the cost, right? But what you're asking is a very different question, and that is it worth the cost to the employer? And I haven't really seen much information, much research on that. I have seen a fair amount of research around, and it's new research around comparing head to head different types of organizations or similar types of organizations in the same industry that rely on either a highly skilled workforce versus a lower skilled workforce. And what are the qualitative differences within those workplaces as it relates to things that are important to employers, like productivity, like return on investment, like market share, those kinds of things. And so what we're finding is that in what those studies are finding is that the performance is moderately different and more beneficial in the higher skills occupational scenario than it is in the lower. But also it has to do with kind of volume and market share. So you can make it up in volume if you're in that kind of a competitive environment. If you're not in that kind of competitive environment where you can make it up in volume, then quality seems to be more important, and the higher skills would seem to be a smarter solution. But we have also seen in areas that have been traditionally known to be low skilled and low paid, a fair amount of research and work going around, well, what if we increase the skills of the workforce and the education of the workforce? What difference would that make? For example, there's some new things going on in agriculture. And of course, that's becoming increasingly technological as well. So we see some shifts in the division of labor between humans and machines there. But we also see some qualitative differences being made when we invest in the workers' skills in ways that we hadn't in the past. And those differences, can be attributed to increased health and safety, decrease in turnover, increased product safety, which is obviously a very big issue in agriculture. So diminishment of foodborne illnesses, those kinds of things. So, I guess the best question is, no, I don't think there's a lot of research out there the best answer is, I don't think there's a lot of research out there that would answer that specific question. But I also think it would need to be asked in a very contextualized way.
Yeah, this almost sounds like something to partner with an economist on.
Absolutely. And that's going to be kind of my final word here today, and that is the need to partner here. Seriously, I mean, these sets of questions and challenges are way outside of our scope. We have a lot to bring to the table. I find that it's really kind of funny and ironic when economists and other, sort of sociologists or other sort of disciplines will, just very sort of haphazardly or very sort of non really thinking about it, just say, oh yeah, lifelong learning. Oh yeah, skills formation. Oh yeah, knowledge generation. And they don't have a clue. They don't have a theory of learning. They don't know what learning looks like. They can't notice it even when they see it. So I think we have as a field, a lot to bring to the stream of research that is really, I think, gonna drive the policy making in this area, both nationally, internationally, as well as in firms. And absent a real understanding of the developmental and social consequences of learning and real learning, I think that research is going to be faulty.
All right, thank you. I apologize for
no, not at all.
Trailing off your presentation.
Not at all. I think it was a great question. So, okay, PIAC. So yeah, contextual factors matter. So really how I've come to start thinking about this is that there's a very big difference between individual mobility and social equity, and I think, we can see where education and increased skills really matter for many individuals. And when I say matter, that their labor market outcomes and their workplace conditions really do shift for the better. But are we really moving the dime on this whole structural equity challenge in question and through an education and training strategy? And I would suggest that this data would help us answer that question in the negative. No, it's not moving the dime. So kind of where do we go? Where do we go from there as a field? And I think, Ben, this is kind of, where you were pointing to, right? So I've come to see these issues, obviously adult education as a field, has a strong social mission related to social justice and social equity. And I would submit that, these conditions call for a new social justice agenda based on education equity and new opportunity structures. And that, our mission needs to expand to include, working on these new opportunity structures. So vocational and workplace learning, to help people find stability in a rapidly changing economic order. I think there's many of us who are doing that, and we do it well. Resources to help people learn to cope and navigate a changing world by actively and continuously restructuring their biographies. There's a tremendous amount of work going on in Europe related to biographical learning and the resources of biography for people and the pedagogical implications for that. I think we can learn from that. I think this is different than, vocational training. It's actually developmental work. I think many of our adult educators do that, but I don't think we look at it from a sociological perspective, which I think would enhance that work. And also I think moving up to that kind of perspective would help us really think about, well, sociologically and from a policy perspective, what is really necessary? What are some of the shifts that need to be made in that area to make a difference? And then a multidisciplinary research agenda and a multi-level practice that expands our role to include building new institutions and structural supports for lifelong learning. And I would also say, you know, interventions into the labor market as well, and into the political economy arena. Yeah, Allison.
Dr.
Yeah.
Hi. What I'm seeing a lot too is a lot of going back to the previous slide, a lot of reflexive learning happening in education. And I see the theory coming out more and more to help adults figure out these changes that are happening in their industry is not only learning the new skill, but reflexively learning who they are as an individual to better understand the new and changing work environments that they are facing.
And I agree. I agree. That's I think a very important news stream that we ought to be paying much more attention to. But I also think that part of that also should be including, you know, what choices do we have here? And what would be the consequences of those choices, not just for ourselves, but for our lives and our relationships, right? So yes. This whole stream of literature, especially coming out of Europe, would suggest that kind of learning is not just developmental for the individual, but they also, Alahite would say that it's a socially explosive force because people make new choices and those choices affect their relationships. And those relationships, when they shift, you know, we don't really know what could happen, right? So, you know, linking those not just to, you know, kind of what's the implication for me here individually, but also, you know, kind of where, you know, how do I navigate this in ways that creates not only more opportunity for me, but more opportunity for others, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, yeah. So it's neat stuff. It's neat stuff.
Yes,
if we can find the resources and the time and space to do it with learners, I think people are really open to it.
Yes, thank you.
And Allison, you asked a question in chat that I'm curious to hear an answer to as well, or not an answer, but a discussion on. And that's, does increased education bring an increased quality of work by the employee? I mean, we would like to assume that it does, but does it actually? That's a good question.
And that's Ben, is something that you and Dr. Scully were discussing earlier. I didn't want to interrupt your flow between the two of you, but that is just something that I thought would be like a kind of an offshoot of what you guys were talking about earlier, about as individuals gain education to increase their employability, does it also increase their quality of work, not just the quantity,
right,
but the quality of the work as well. And that was what I was curious about.
Yeah. Well, Mike, does someone want to respond to that?
Well, I have my thoughts, but I'll wait for somebody else because I've been talking a little bit already.
I think that might have just been feedback, Alan.
Okay. Well, again, I think context matters, right? So I think if we just kind of throw more education and skill at a workplace, it doesn't necessarily mean that's gonna change anything. It doesn't necessarily mean it will change the conditions. Doesn't necessarily mean it will change the quality of the work, or, you know, the improve productivity, or whatever measure you might be looking towards. I think it's necessary in some instances, but not sufficient, because if you're educating people and you're not also opening up the work system in ways that allows for them to have discretion to utilize what they know and their skills in ways that they deem to be important, then you're not going to necessarily reap the benefits that you might expect otherwise. So it's, you got to look at it as from a systems perspective, right? If you're going to intervene into a work situation, a workplace, an industry, a firm, in ways that are, you know, you say, okay, now we're a knowledge firm, so everybody needs a degree, right? but you haven't changed your work systems, you haven't changed your job structures, you haven't changed your reporting structures, then I don't think you're going to see you're not going to reap the results that you're looking for. I don't know, Ben, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, it's a different perspective that I'm coming from. Mm-hmm. Kind of going back to the original question that you really kind of caught me up, Allison. So I work with the Department of Defense. And most people don't realize this, but just about everybody over the rank of major to lieutenant colonel has a master's degree, if not a PhD. If you're a colonel, you probably have 2 master's degrees at minimum. But I've been working with the Department of Defense long enough to learn that folks who have the education aren't necessarily the brightest tools in the shed or the most effective leaders, or insert metaphor here. So I see, but I also see some guys who don't have that education and on paper should not be promoted, but just the sheer dint of their personality and competence, they get promoted over folks who have higher education. But they are much fewer and far between. So I say that all to kind of like provide both ends of the spectrum. But what I see primarily is education does not mean increased quality, whether in output or ability to think, or even the quality of work. I see it as amplifying those who have quality, and as they progress through the ranks and have more responsibility, their quality shine more and more. But education by itself, I don't see that precisely as the measure for quality of work. It's a very large assumption. It's a very large correlation. But I think it is not the causal factor.
I don't think I disagree. I think education in our labor market has become a proxy for measuring something else. So, what are we really measuring with someone has a degree? Are we measuring, do we think we're measuring do we think that degree communicates to us what they should know and be able to do? And I think in many instances that is the case, but does it really reflect what our requirements are, right?
So in different words, would you say it measures potential? Is that like, I'm trying to figure out exactly what you're saying.
I think it measures, I'm not sure what it measures. I think employers use it as a proxy for something else.
Okay.
That something else is kind of what they think is important, right? So an employer who once maybe would have hired a kid out of high school for an administrative job, and then, her, because mostly it was her, they would provide her a series of on-the-job trainings and job promotions that would allow for her to develop the skills that they need. Now, most administrative jobs require a bachelor's degree, if not higher. And is that because the skills requirements or the job requirements have really shifted? Or is that because employers got lazy and they said, oh, well, we just don't want to do all this onboarding training anymore. Let's just make sure that they come with us with more education, and they ought to be able to do it. I don't know. I mean, I think that a lot, go back to some of the earlier slides where there's conflicting evidence about what the role of education really is in the labor market. And I think the question about does it really achieve the outcomes that we think it should? Well, I think, there's a lot of policy debates out there that suggest that it doesn't, that people are very dissatisfied with the quality of the skills and the abilities of people coming out of education, because they can't do anything. So we have, so there's all this employability stuff that we saw on the first slide, that maybe the education system isn't directed at developing. So where do people develop those employability skills? I mean,
I think that's a good question, Ellen. I think that goes to your adult education imperatives, where you discuss what are those, what is the new role of educators, and what do those new institutions or structural supports look like, right?
Exactly.
There's this changing face of education, especially higher education.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think people are becoming increasingly disenchanted with, credentials, educational credentials, because they're just, they're laggards for the most part. Higher ed can't keep up with the shifts. We certainly can't provide people with the kinds of employment experiences that, help them develop judgment and discretion and leadership, which are all the things that you're noticing, Ben, right?
Yeah, very much. And
yeah.
It's really interesting. You said that about proxy for something else, and I've had this conversation, and I think you're onto something.
Mm-hmm.
The discussion I've had with folks is it's a proxy for knowing that somebody's going to be able to stick in there and complete tasks that are given to them, rather than just leaving. I mean, able to invest in something and be there for 4 years and come out with something on
mm-hmm.
the other end.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
I've seen people who get hired out of the military with the same attitude as somebody having a degree.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so we have a little over 10 minutes. So Ellen, if you'd like to.
Sure, I just have one more, there's other things, but there's just one more slide that I think is important to this conversation, and that is, kind of the imperatives continue to some of the policy areas that I think we need to begin to think about how we as a field begin to develop an agenda and begin to try to influence. So obviously there's education reform, there's, resources for lifelong education, career pathways, kind of trying to align the educational experiences that people have with the careers that they might pursue, and providing them with more sort of that hands-on employability types of experiences, the alignment of basic academic and technical ed. I mean, this stuff has been around forever, in terms of, trying to get at this whole idea that, education is a bit of a laggard because we just can't keep up with the shifts that are going on in the workplace and in people's lives. So can we think about, can we get beyond the 3-credit course, which is kind of my big challenge these days, to make, education and training and reflection more timely and more minute, so people can actually engage in it on an ongoing basis. This is an interesting stream also coming out of Europe, and I think we're starting to see some of this here in the country. Universal basic income, for example. It's a whole sort of philosophy that, okay, work is changing, labor market is changing, everything's in transition, it's not going to stop, you're not ever going to stabilize it. So if we accept that as a new normal, then what is the institutional arrangements that we need? What are some of the ongoing supports that both employers and workers need to provide some, I wouldn't say stability, but some security in this more sort of transitional labor market? So, kind of workplace credentials, portability skills, employer carrots and sticks, kind of what can we do to ensure that employers make investments in people's skills? What can we do to make sure that employers aren't de-skilling work in ways that they don't need to? And that, they're offering, good quality jobs for folks. How is it that we provide people with income security? And employers, how do we make skills pay for them as well? How do we create a level playing field in an industry, for example, so that it really costs the employer who chooses a low road strategy in ways that, they can't sell their products, for example. because, you know, the bar has been raised for everybody and the expectations are of a higher quality. And then, of course, new employment regulations, because, you know, as work becomes more contingent, less and less workers are covered by our employment laws and our employment protections. So we have a large amount of people who are working regularly today who aren't, you know, covered by Social Security, for example. They're not, they don't have any sort of rights to sue their employers over certain things. It's, you know, becoming an increasing issue for a larger amount of people. So I'm going to stop there. I've got a couple other things, but, you know, I think that, you know, it's mostly related to research, and we can talk offline if you're interested.
Couldn't find my button there. All right, do we have any, I mean, this has been a very robust discussion. I think we could probably have 2 or 3 more webinars on this, Ellen, with all the different topics that you brought forward and all of our enthusiasm in terms of advocacy, policy, changes in training, changes in structure. Right. But I want to open it up to see if there are any other questions besides being able to contact Dr. Ellen personally after the webinar, if you're open to that, Ellen.
I certainly am. Absolutely. I welcome that.
Okay, great. And then, of course, this webinar will be available for review and available at the Compendium website. Dr. Knox, did you have any concluding thoughts that you wanted to provide us?
No, just to thank the several people, particularly who raised questions and made comments to add to the large number of items that Ellen has shared with us now. And just to mention that every 2 months there'll be another opportunity to discuss with an author of an article from the Compendium some of the contents that are there. And we welcome any feedback from people who were registered and participated in this session or in the coming weeks play an archived version of this. And so that feedback will guide the people who are going to be doing so every 2 months. So thank you, Ellen, very much.
Yeah. Yep.
Thank you, Alan. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yes. All right. So thank you, Dr. Ellen. We know that we can do a lot to influence humans and human beings' needs in the workplace and advocate for the future of work based upon your expertise. And so we thank you for your discussion and sharing your thoughts with us this afternoon. AAACE would like to remind you, as Alan said, that we have future webinars posted at the Compendium website and the AAACE website. There's one in June, August, and October. And you can also purchase the Compendium and find the information on Dr. Ellen Scully-Russ's Article 62, Adult Education for Employment in the Global Economy. And so we thank you for being with us today, and we hope to see you in the future.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.